Our essential question is, how do you graph a quadratic function? We have 4 new vocab words for today: domain, range, maximum, and minimum. The domain, you may remember from chapter 1, represents all of the possible values for x. The range, all of the possible values for y. Maximum and minimum. For day 1, we learned that standard form looked like this: y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So what we're talking about today with the maximum and minimum is that if the value for a, the coefficient of x squared, if that value is negative, it makes the graph open downward, which makes the vertex the highest point on the graph, which is called a maximum. If that value for a is positive, then the graph is going to open upward, which makes the vertex point the lowest point on the graph, or a minimum. Our first example says, consider f of x equals negative 2x squared minus 4x plus 6. There are a couple of different questions, and this really matches what you'll see in your homework. Determine whether it has a maximum or minimum, state that maximum or minimum, which is the vertex, and then state the domain and range of the function. As a hint, it says you may want to sketch a graph. A lot of you are probably visual learners, so I am going to always sketch a graph for you. So in order to find the vertex, we have to find the axis of symmetry first using this formula like we did on day 1. The opposite of b over 2a. Our values for a is -2, b is -4, and c is 6. So the opposite of b, if b is -4, the opposite of b is +4. 2 times a, which is -2, would be -4. If I divide those, I get my symmetry line, or axis of symmetry, at -1. So on my graph over here, I'm going to sketch my axis of symmetry line at -1, like that. Now, to find the rest of my vertex has a coordinate, an x coordinate of -1, but I'm going to have to plug in that -1 into my function up here to figure out the value for y. So the value of my function at -1, I substitute -1 for both x's and then use the order of operations. So exponent first, -1 squared is 1. Then I can multiply from left to right, -2, +4. So my y coordinate of my vertex is 8. Now I'm ready to graph my vertex. So my vertex is right on my axis of symmetry. It's -1, 8, which would be right here. Then I can graph my y-intercept. C is my y-intercept. So my y-intercept equals 6. So on the y-axis, I'm going to go up 6 from the origin and plot my y-intercept. Then I have to balance it on the other side of my symmetry line so that I've got 3 points and I can graph my quadratic. Now, looking at that quadratic, my vertex is a maximum. It's the highest point on the graph. So I've answered 2 of my questions right here, found that it's a maximum, and found the value. Now I just need my domain and range. The domain is represented by all of the possible values for x. You can plug in anything you want for x. X is our independent variable. So my domain is all real numbers. I can plug in positive numbers, negative numbers, decimals, fractions, any real number, and I can solve my quadratic. My range, on the other hand, is restricted because the highest point for y on this graph right here is 8. So all of my y values are less than or equal to 8. So that's found by looking at the vertex and the y coordinate. Because it's a maximum, it's the highest point. One more example just like that first one with the same directions. So I'm going to start out by identifying A, B, and C. Next, find the axis of symmetry. X equals the opposite of B over 2A. The opposite of -4 is 4. 2 times A, which is 2, gives me another 4. So if I divide those, I get 1. So my axis of symmetry is +1. The next step is to find the rest of my vertex. So I know my vertex has an x-coordinate of +1. I'm going to plug that in. Now solve using the order of operations. 1 squared is 1. Multiply. And I get my y-coordinate of -3. So my vertex is 1, -3. +1, -3. There's my vertex. Next, I can graph my y-intercept. My y-intercept is my value for C, so it's -1. Then balance it on the other side of the symmetry line. The vertex is the only point that lies on the symmetry line. All of the other points have a mirror image that's on the opposite side. So this vertex, you can tell by my graph, is a minimum because it's the lowest point on the graph. So the vertex is a minimum and it's at 1, -3. So we've answered the first 2 questions. Domain, again, is all real numbers. We can put in anything we want for that x and solve it. The range is restricted again. The lowest point for the range is -3. The y-coordinate of the vertex is -3. All of the other points are above it, so my y values have to be greater than or equal to -3 for this quadratic. We have 2 examples left, and these 2 examples represent the other part of your homework. And what those problems look like, they simply ask you to graph. So, to graph, I'm going to identify A, B, and C, find the axis of symmetry, using my formula, x equals opposite of B over 2A. So, the opposite of 4 over 2 times 1, -4 divided by 2 is -2. So my axis of symmetry is -2. Going to plug it in to figure out what y is. So -2 squared plus 4 times -2 plus 3. -2 squared is 4. Then I can multiply and get -8 plus 3 equals -1. So my vertex, if I put together my x and y coordinates, my vertex is -2, -1. Left 2, down 1. Then my y-intercept is C. So I can plot my y-intercept. 3 on the y-axis, up 3, balance it on the other side, and draw my parabola. And I'm done. The last example, A is -2, B is -8, C is -2. Axis of symmetry. X equals the opposite of B over 2A. The opposite of -8 is 8. 2 times -2 is -4. So dividing them gives me an axis of symmetry of -2 again. I can graph my symmetry line and then plug it in. This one's a little bit trickier than the last one because there's a coefficient in front of our x squared. So the order of operations, negative 2 squared is 4. Then I can do my multiplying, negative 8, positive 16. So my y-coordinate is 6. So my vertex is negative 2, positive 6. So negative 2, positive 6 would be right here. Then my y-intercept is C. So I can graph that, negative 2 on the y-axis, and balance it on the other side. And draw my parabola. And we're done. You should be able to write a summary now, answering your essential question. And you should be able to complete all of your homework problems. Please make sure that you read the directions carefully to make sure that you're answering what they are asking for on each section of your homework. If a graph is not required, then you do not have to graph it. It's an option for you though if you're a more visual learner, especially if it helps you figure out your domain and range or your max and min.